£28. That was the value of the ticket to travel on the HMT Empire Windrush in 1948 from Kingston Harbour in Jamaica to Tilbury Docks, Essex, England. That was the beginning of the journey of what we know as the Windrush generation, leaving the Caribbean and coming to the motherland. £28, well over £1,000 in today's value. And there were over 1,028 passengers from all over the world. The majority of them were from the Caribbean, some 492. The Windrush generation, in which myself, Clive Foster, I'm a proud descendant. And my talk today is about how we can transform social injustice, lessons from the Windrush Scandal. So who is the Windrush generation? This was a generation that answered the call of the mother country after two devastating world wars to come and rebuild the United Kingdom. They came in their Sunday best, pinstripe suits, felt hats, laced gloves. They came wanting to make themselves better, their families better, and to put the great back in Great Britain. And they came knowing that they had the skills, the ability, and the determination to do that. This was a generation that answered that call. And sadly, this generation suffered a terrible injustice. And my talk today is about how we can transform social injustice. And there are three things I'd like to cover. Number one, how do we recognize it? Number two, how do we go on to act when we see social injustice? And number three, let's speak out about social injustice. So this great enthusiasm that the Windrush generation came over with, when they came, sadly, we know that in 2017, and they came over many decades from the 40s, 50s and 60s, we know that in 2017, it began to emerge that sadly, this generation was wrongly classified as illegal. The government at the time developed a hostile environment policy, and people who were rightly classified, who had the legal and moral right to be in the country, found themselves potentially threatened with deportation, threatened to be detained, losing their jobs, and potentially, sadly, losing a whole sense of their dignity. Now, when this emerged, it became very clear that something had to change. And so the first thing I'd like to talk about in terms of transforming social injustice is to ask ourselves, are we recognizing the injustices around us? I want to take you back to a spring morning in my local church in May of 2018. And it started to emerge that we were hearing stories that sadly people who had the legal and the moral right to be in the country were perhaps being threatened to be turned away. Now, what is a scandal? A scandal is any event or any action which is both morally and legally wrong and causes a public outrage. And I remember it was my opportunity in my own local church in this Sunday morning to close the service. And I became aware in that week that we were hearing some stories of how people were being wrongly, potentially deported or detained because they couldn't prove their legal right to be in the country. So I remember looking out to the congregation and saying, some of you may be hearing some stories that sadly there are some accusations that people from the Caribbean are being said that they may have to try and prove their lawful right to be in the country. And I looked out to the congregation and some people were nodding their heads saying, yeah, I think I've heard that story. Some people looked at me very puzzled and to say, what are you talking about? And some people looked at their watch as if to say, come on, it's time for you to close the service. I want to go home and get my rice and peas and chicken. And so I said, if you've been hearing these stories, and perhaps you may feel a little bit concerned about that, please come and speak to some of the ministers and we'll hear you out and listen. I was astonished at the end of the service that there was an orderly queue formed and there was a number of people who came up to the ministers and they began to say, Clive, I'm concerned about my grandfather. He hasn't got his passport sorted out and we're hearing stories that could be deported. Clive, I'm concerned about my uncle. He still hasn't got his paperwork sorted out and we're concerned. And it was in that moment that I recognized that there was a problem. There was an individual problem, but there was a recognition that there was a pattern of problems happening. And in transforming social injustice, I want to pose a question to you. How is your antennae for recognizing social injustice? Are we prepared to listen and to hear when someone speaks about an injustice? And it was in that moment that we had to move on and take the next step in terms of what I believe are some of the lessons of the Windrush Scandal in terms of transforming social injustice. So having heard the stories, we decided that we had to take the second point, and that is to act. To transform social injustice, you have to act. So when we began to hear these stories, some of the leaders of the local congregation said, we've got to do something. We've got to act. We've got to speak to other people who can help us in this moment. And so we decided that we had to put on surgeries. We had to put on a safe space where people could come and talk and share their feeling of injustice. And so we put on these surgeries. And believe you me, it was that very small action that caused us to discover so many injustices. And I want to say what's really important is that the small act can lead to a great change. And it was this very small act of saying, we're going to put on a surgery, we're going to invite people who know more than us in terms of the legal implications of your situation, and we're going to bring on counselors who can help you and support you as well. And we were astonished at the stories that we were hearing. When we put on the surgeries, people came. One lady, I remember fondly, a senior citizen from the Windrush generation, she shared, Clive, I've been in this country all my life, went out to Jamaica on holiday, coming back, I got stopped and was detained. And they says, you don't have the right to come back into the country. I said, how did it make you feel? I was humiliated, Clive. Another person says, Clive, my brother died and I wanted to go out to the Caribbean to prepare for his service, went to get a passport, having a business in the country and set out to do this business and lived over 40 years in the country. And when he went to the passport place, they said, we can give you a passport to go, no guarantee you're coming back. The stories were heart-wrenching because it was the trauma and the dignity that was lost, thinking that this was the mother country and they were feeling so rejected, like flotsam and jetsam, thrown and discarded. And finally, there was one person who came to the surgery who moved me very much. It was an elderly gentleman. And he kind of walked in like that. He had a bad leg, I believe. And he came and he pulled out black passport, a bit like this. This is my father's passport, original passport. And He pulled out a passport like that, and he pulled out a piece of paper, and he showed me the passport, and he showed me the piece of paper, and the paper said, a member of the British Army. I thought, wow, you were prepared to take a bullet for the country, and now you're afraid of being deported? It was so powerful. And so when we took that action, more people came, and we decided that we had to continue to act to support them to transform. In transforming social justice, it won't happen unless we take some action, however small, however large, but the courage to act. And then the last thing I believe is really important in terms of transforming social injustice is the power to speak out. Simply to speak out courageously about an injustice. What we recognized from the lessons of the Windrush Scandal was that you had to confront the powers, what was causing the injustice. And that took some courage. That took some courage to speak to leaders, bigger organizations, and to say that there are people who are suffering. But in that speaking out, as a small group of people, more people came forward to seek for justice and to seek to get themselves corrected in terms of documentation. So I want to challenge you today. Are you speaking out when you see an injustice? A small act of showing compassion can make a big difference in a person's life. So people suffered, people lost their dignity, people lost their homes, people were detained. But I want to say this, in all those people that I have described today, I am pleased to say that every one of them got their documents sorted and received multiple pounds of compensation. And I say that to say this, whatever the injustice, the power and the ability is there to transform. And that's the lessons of the Windrush Scandal. That it can be transformative in terms of social injustice. And not only that, that transformation is not just for the individual, but for the community. A sense of dignity, a sense of pride, a sense of a better country, a sense of a better nation. And that transformation, in a very humble beginning, we now know that the story of the Windrush generation is now not just a story of people who've been suffering injustice, but it's now a story that celebrates the extraordinary contribution of the Windrush generation to the UK, that came and worked in the mines and the factories like my own father, that came and worked in the NHS like my own mother, that came and helped in the transport situation. And I am incredibly grateful of the extraordinary contribution and the efforts and the dignity and the determination of the Windrush generation, because they demonstrated in their willingness to make this country their home that they can transform injustice. And so, finally, I'd like to say that in the process of transformation, anyone and everyone can play a part. Anyone and everyone can play a part. I think with Dr. King, who said, social justice never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. And in this scenario, it takes us to recognize injustice, it takes us to act on injustice, and it takes us to speak out for injustice. And my final comment would be, in the lessons of the Windrush generation, And my challenge to you is that to the world, you're perhaps just one person when it comes to injustice. But to one person, you can be all the world. Thank you.